So this lecture will focus on three figures from the Middle Ages and Renaissance who are considered crucial to sort of developing a theoretical critical framework for a secular national literature, which is essentially the way that we tend to categorize these things nowadays in national terms and not according to the necessities of ancient or religious desires, beliefs, values, etc. So Dante Alighieri, also usually just referred to as Dante, lived from 1265 to 1321. He wrote the Divine Comedy, which is an epic poem in three parts that chronicles a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. In writing the Divine Comedy, he established the dialect of Tuscany in northern Italy as the foundation of literary Italian. So basically, Florentine Italian becomes the sort of accepted, quote unquote, proper literary Italian. Which sounds elitist, and maybe it is, but in his time, this was a step away from Latin as the literary language. And so he very much provides both an explicit and implicit argument for the use of the vernacular over scholarly sacred languages. And he's very, very heavily indebted to the scholastics. Secondly, we'll talk about Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio is best known for the Decameron. It's a collection of 100 tales told by a group of young people during the Black Death, so during the plague. Basically, the frame narrative is that these individuals escape Florence and go out to a rural estate in order to wait out the plague, and while there, they entertain each other by taking turns telling stories, and it becomes this compendium of short stories that are really, really influential. If you haven't read the Decameron, maybe you've read the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is inspired by the Decameron. And even texts that are not typically seen as being influenced by the Decameron use a lot of these motifs. So, for example, you may have heard the story of how Frankenstein was written. Mary Shelley, who at the time was married to Percy Bysshe Shelley, goes out into, I believe it's a cabin in Switzerland or something like that, and with Lord Byron and John Keats, I think, they start a storytelling competition, and they all tell stories, and Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein. Now, the accuracy of this is disputed. It's almost certainly an apocryphal tale, but this idea of the act of creativity coming from individuals sort of closed off from the rest of society and trying to entertain each other telling stories is a very popular frame narrative. It's a very popular trope throughout literary history, and Boccaccio is perhaps the best known originator of it. Not the first, definitely not the absolute first, but a major figure in Renaissance literature. And then finally, we have Joachim DuBellay, a later figure, Renaissance French author. He is actually best known as a member of La Pléiade, which is a sort of group of poets who advocated for establishing a strong French literary tradition. And his best known poetry is The Regrets, which, funny enough, considering the other two people in this presentation are Florentine poets, what The Regrets is about is DuBellay traveling to Italy to see Florence because he's so inspired by his favorite poets, who include Dante and Boccaccio. And then he hates it. He hates it, and all he wants to do is get back to Paris. And so he writes this book of poems about it. But honestly, what he's best known for is actually the book from which our reading comes, which is The Defense and Enrichment of the French Language. And in it, he essentially argues for the development of a French literature as a matter of national pride. Now, these are three very different authors with some very different contributions, but all of their theories around the development of literature, the vernacular, etc., share a few questions. One of them is, what is the relationship between language, truth, and authority? The other is, what is the role of poetry in cultivating this relationship? And then finally, what is the role of the vernacular? So hopefully the readings illuminated that a bit for you, but also this lecture will try to supplement those readings. So the works of Dante that we read were from Il Convivio and Letter to Can Grande. One of the things that Dante does in Il Convivio that you will probably have noticed is quite familiar is this breaking down of the senses of meaning. And this comes straight from Augustine through Aquinas to Dante. The first sense, of course, is the literal sense, and Dante defines this as being only the surface of the letter, what we see, right? The second is the allegorical, which Dante defines as truth hidden beneath a beautiful fiction. Third is the moral, which conveys lessons of right, wrong, and truth. And then the fourth is the anagogical, which is beyond the senses, that which is spiritually intended. And this is specific to theology. There is really no anagogical sense in which, for example, this class is going to be reading texts. This has to do with spiritual needs. And so as such, Dante has to do a little bit of work to kind of define these terms a little differently. And the literal, only the surface of the letter, always comes first, because the literal is the linguistic foundation from which all interpretations can then arise. So Dante is very much an author who views himself as a religious author. What's interesting is that, or one of the things that's interesting, a sort of paradox in Dante's critical theoretical writing is that while he describes his reasoning behind understanding his poetry to be essentially theologically inflected, more so than secular, much of the way that he describes it provides a foundation for a secular understanding of poetry. And so when he says the literal always comes first, he's talking about linguistics. He's not talking about a hierarchy of, that includes God and human beings. The literal comes first is a very, very common sense understanding of how texts are read. And so, in a linguistic sense, the implication is that the literal is top. but we're not applying any sort of moral or value to this. He's talking in very concrete, experiential terms. The literal always comes first. Without the literal, you can't understand anything else. In order to understand a metaphor, you have to understand the similarities between the thing and the idea that it represents, which means you still have to understand the literal first. And Dante goes to great pains to explain that it's impossible to be otherwise, and even if it were possible, we would run into conceptual problems. Another familiar move is that Dante, and actually I don't think this specific portion was in the anthologized version that you read, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. Dante talks about docere, movere, and delectare, which is to teach, to move, and to delight. This will likely bring to mind two of the authors that we've read, one of whom is Augustine, and then through Augustine also Aquinas, and honestly Maimonides also does this, talking about the ways that delighting and moving the reader pulls them into a teachable moment. But also Horace, right? Remember that Horace's understanding of poetry was very much to say that it is meant to teach and to delight. And that brings us to the letter to Can Grande. Now, Can Grande was the imperial vicar of Verona, so he was a very, powerful priest, and he was Dante's patron. He was the guy basically paying for Dante to be a professional poet. Incidentally, the expression Can Grande is Italian for big dog. So this is, if you're translating it literally, this is the letter to Big Dog, which honestly I love, and I wish that that's how they wrote the title in the Norton anthology, because that would be hilarious. So anyway, Dante's writing to his boss, Big Dog, and he provides a hermeneutic guide to the Divine Comedy, his best-known work. Now, this is considered necessary by Dante because it's a polysemous work. We talked about polysemy with Maimonides and Aquinas. And of course, it means that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Here again, Dante, in talking about his work in this way, provides a foundation for thinking of his religious poem in a secular way, whereas his intention, expressed in the letter to Big Dog, is actually the opposite. It is to defend his religious poem that is written in vernacular Italian, to show that even though it's not written in the sacred language of Latin, it is capable of delivering important religious philosophical themes. And so he asserts in this way that truth can be hidden in poetic fiction, and that interpretation of that fiction requires a trained moral philosophical mind. And so this is all very much in keeping with Aquinas. He's essentially making a religious argument. But as you might have guessed, or as you can see, this also provides an understanding of language and literature as flexible in a way that makes it so that his argument for how religious his poem is actually can also work as an argument for his poem as a secular work, because it's talking about multivalence or polysemy or multiple meanings, multiple levels of meaning. And so at one point, Dante talks about the allegory of the poets versus the allegory of the theologians. And he aligns himself with the theologians. He considers his use of allegory to be something sacred, but he's doing it in the non-sacred language. And so again, there's this flexibility to it that's really interesting. He opens a door that he doesn't explicitly say he wants to open, but it's there. And of course, polysemy is something that we've seen multiple times, but especially in Aquinas. And just like Aquinas and just like Augustine before him, Dante defines the polysemous nature of literature, of language, as, and I've already said this, but the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. Now, because moral and anagogical are spiritual categories of meaning, if we're to just look at this linguistically, then those are varieties of allegory. Here again, Dante is doing something that he kind of suggests he doesn't want to do, but it's an interesting point. If we're separating the secular study of linguistics from the sacred study of scriptural meaning, then as a linguistic category, the moral and the anagogical don't really mean much, okay? And so, unless we're literally upholding Christian theology and Christian belief, then the anagogical and the moral really are subcategories of allegory. And in this way, he sort of cuts out the moral and the anagogical as areas of linguistic or literary study. And in doing so, he effectively secularizes Aquinas' definitions, which is really interesting. He's taking on Aquinas' definitions, and doing so in a way that he considers himself to be very much in Aquinas' tradition. He sees his use of allegory as primarily theological, not poetic. But by laying out the differences, by saying, look, linguistically, these two things just don't mean anything outside of allegory, he essentially sets up the terms for reading his poem in a different way than it was intended, which is he secularizes religious aesthetics. We can enjoy this. We can understand it. We can interpret it. We can even understand it religiously as we reject the ultimate religious message, right? So Giovanni Boccaccio, best known, as I said, for the Decameron, wrote Genealogy of the Gentile Gods, and it was published in 1362. It was intended as a grand work of scholarship on classical mythology, basically covering kind of like an encyclopedia of Greek and Roman myths. And within that, Book 14 sort of compiles and debates with criticisms of poetry that had been in circulation since at least Plato's time. So we kind of started this with Plato, and Boccaccio is using that as his sort of jumping off point. Now, he starts from a position similar to Plato's view of poetry, not because he's necessarily in agreement with it, but as a way to sort of enter into that discussion. Now, he respects philosophy as a pursuit of truth that is aligned with true religion, in other words, Christianity, and Christian morality. But he criticizes those who moralize based on what he considers to be a limited understanding of philosophy. And he specifically uses this label for those who would dismiss poetry. What's interesting is that he uses a Platonist critique of imitation in order to describe these people as imitating wisdom. It's a really interesting argument, and he says that whatever they don't know, they damn. And so, basically, In other words, there's a sort of twofold move here that's very interesting that Boccaccio is making. The first is that he uses Plato's logic, Plato's hatred of imitation, not to describe poetry, but to describe readers of Plato who are basically weak scholars. And he says they are faking their intelligence and their intellect. And so they are imitators in the worst sense. And because of that, they lack the intelligence or the discernment to understand poetry. The other thing he's doing here is that he's basically saying the most literal interpretation of Plato's Republic, this idea that Plato really expects us to just discard all poetry, is a weak reading of Plato. And most scholars agree with this. Plato's Republic posits an ideal republic ruled by philosopher kings where all the subjects are studying philosophy. It's this sort of utopian ideal. And what's interesting is that nobody really goes through and picks apart the unlikelihood, for example, of a philosopher king, but we're all supposed to take Plato's admonitions against poetry literally. And Boccaccio says this is a ridiculous reading of Plato, and anybody who takes it super literally in this way is, in fact, a bad reader of Plato, a bad philosopher, and their dismissal of poetry stems from ignorance on the topic and their lack of aesthetic discernment, or in other words, their lack of taste, which is parading as morality and wisdom, which is in itself an imitation. And so Boccaccio goes into this definition of poetry, which he describes as a sort of fervid and exquisite invention with fervid expression in speech or writing of that which the mind has invented. It's sublime in its effects. It impels the soul to a longing for utterance. It brings forth strange and unheard of creations of the mind. Now, you may notice those first three are very heavy on the idea of inspiration. And then the next two are going to, or the next three, are much more on the craft or art side. So poetry arranges these meditations in a fixed order and adorns the whole composition with unusual interweaving of words and thoughts. It veils truth in a fair and fitting garment of fiction. That's straight out of Aquinas, right? And then it inspires greatness. And this is sort of having to do with the effects of the arts. He gives this entire list, which we don't need to go down, but it includes, kings going into battle and all this stuff. And so the inspiration of the artist, the craft of the artist, produces something that inspires the reader. His definition of poetry also discusses it as a combination of nature and art. In other words, inspiration and craft. So, as Boccaccio says, however deeply the poetic impulse stirs the mind to which it is granted, it very rarely accomplishes anything commendable if the instruments by which its concepts are to be wrought out are wanting. I mean, for example, the precepts of grammar and rhetoric. In other words, you still got to study. You still got to practice. This is a craft. It's not just divine madness. And he talks about nature as both a source of inspiration for the poet and an example of creativity of God. So, in other words, nature is both something that inspires, that gives inspiration to the artist, to the poet, but also is an example of the ways in which God brings some sort of creativity, craft into the world. And so I can't remember exactly who it was before that we read, but this argument has been made before that to dismiss creativity, to dismiss art and design is to dismiss the creations of God. And then he gives this very bare bones
definition that I actually really like, which is that poetry is considered an art because nothing directly proceeds from its creation. In other words, the product of poetry is poetry, right? The product of carpentry might be a house or a cabinet. The product of medicine, or of, I guess the product of medicine is medicine, but it's health, right? Art creates art. Poetry creates poetry. It might inspire other things, but when a poet writes a poem, what is produced is the poem, right? And then he goes into this breakdown of obscurity as a problem. Remember, this is Plato's issue if we're reading Plato in the most literal sense. Plato doesn't like linguistic confusion. He doesn't like figurative language. It confuses, it lies. Augustine wrestles with this. There's figurative language in the Bible. How do we deal with this? We need to figure it out. Maimonides also wrestles with it, but is not as worried about it. Aquinas definitely is worried about it. And so here comes Boccaccio, and he says the obscurity of the poem is not the good poet's fault. And I put good in parentheses because Boccaccio says the poet, but he's talking about good poets, right? And this is already implied in his previous description, which is, you got to work at it. The obscurity, if obscurity is a problem for poetry, it's the reader's problem, not the poet's problem. And then he goes on to say, look, philosophy and scripture both have obscure passages too. Are we to discard these things? Of course not. And in this way, he elevates the linguistic use or the linguistic work of poetry to the level of philosophy and scripture, essentially saying that this is just as noble a use of language. He then goes on to make this Aquinas point: obscurity veils the sacred and encourages study. He does not, his elitism here extends only to the act of studying and perfecting the craft, not so much to the idea that there are worthy or unworthy people. And so in this way, he is very much secularizing Aquinas' point again, even though he essentially makes the same point. So whereas Aquinas and Maimonides take this and say, well, obscurity veils the sacred so that those who are unworthy can't access it, Boccaccio says obscurity veils the sacred so that those who are unworthy can study and become worthy. Right? And he's talking about poetry, not scripture. And so it inspires discussion and engagement. And while this idea of needing to study, needing to get better, being worthy to understand the poetry certainly has an elitist edge to it, there is also something sort of inherently democratic in this idea that discussion and engagement with texts are something desired rather than sort of maintaining the sacred separate from those who are unworthy. And then Boccaccio does this thing where he says basically to deny this logic, which is the logic of Plato and the logic of Aquinas applied to poetry, is simply ignorant cowardice. It is to apply one's own ignorance as wisdom because we don't understand something and we're too cowardly to learn it. And just on a very personal level, I kind of love that. So let's talk about DuBellay. Joachim DuBellay is actually best known, despite writing a lot of poetry and actually revolutionizing the use of various forms in French. He is actually best known for his contributions to enriching French as a literary language, sort of almost as a political move, rather than being known for the poems themselves. In other words, he introduces the sonnet form to French He changes the way that French Renaissance poets write, but other poets sort of perfected it, and he is not as well known for the poetry itself as he is for his project of making French, of popularizing French as a poetic language. And so his contribution is huge, but not in the same way as Dante and Boccaccio. So for DuBellay, poetry is an explicitly nationalist project. This is sort of a patriotic endeavor. Remember that during DuBellay's time, we're starting to get the modern nation. What we would call France is really coming together as France. Even when you look to Boccaccio and Dante, these were not, we call them Italian authors now, but they would have identified as Tuscan or Florentine poets, not as Italian. Because Italy was not a unified nation until the 19th century. And even today, if you go to Italy, in most places, you'll see flags of the region as much or more than the Italian flag. It's still a very regionally proud nation. And so this idea of a French literature or an Italian literature is pretty new, and one of the reasons for that is just the dominance of Latin and Greek. So DuBellay is trying to kind of pick at that, but there's this paradox because he also promotes the imitation of classical forms, of Greek and Roman forms. And so how does that work? Well, he's focused on poetry as a craft, right? Both Boccaccio and Dante in this unit discussed the combination of craft and inspiration. DuBellay doesn't. That's not to say that he doesn't believe in inspiration, but it's just not his focus. He's talking about craft. He's talking about some very practical matters, and he's doing so because he's concerned with the political implications. And the political implications are linguistic implications. Basically, he's talking about the ways in which creating a French vernacular literature will popularize French as a language of scholarship, intellect, and culture, and therefore strengthen French society, honestly. So let's look at how he does this. First, he launches into a defense of the French vernacular. Now, remember, what vernacular means is the everyday language of the people of a particular place. And vernacular literature was not really, I don't even want to say popular because most people couldn't read, but let's say popular among those who were literate. But Greek and Roman for centuries are upheld as these superior literary languages in Europe. And what DuBellay argues is that no one language is superior to any other. All languages are made by human beings, come from human intellect. And so there is a Renaissance humanism to this. At this point, you're starting to get this idea of humanity being equal as human beings. We're starting to dispense with the idea of barbarians, this idea that people outside of Greece or Rome are somehow less human, less capable of the things that make us human. So within the rubric of this Renaissance humanism, DuBellay is able to make this argument, all humans being equal, no language is superior to any other. And so he questions the superiority of Greco-Roman models. And he gives this brief sort of historical overview in which he discusses the dominance of Greek and Roman literature coming not from the superiority, but from power. Not superiority of language or intellect, but of power. In other words, we're talking about two massive empires that held sway over a massive chunk of the world, over 3 continents. And as such, not only were able to sort of impose their culture on other people, but also had the material resources to just have more writers and more libraries and more preservation, so that when we look to ancient Greece and ancient Rome from the vantage point of Renaissance France, for one thing, you get rid of all the crap. There was plenty of bad poetry written in Greece and Rome, but there was so much of it that the only stuff that sort of makes its way into Renaissance France is the good ones. And so you go, wow, Greece and Rome, amazing. And then also, it establishes this cultural power over the rest of Europe, such that for centuries after, even after the fall of Rome, in France, in Italy, Latin is considered to be the literary language. And so DuBellay says there's nothing inherent in Latin that makes it necessary for us to consider it a superior language. It is 100% a product of this sort of arbitrary accident of history that they were just more powerful for a very long time. But Rome is done. Now we can do something else. And that brings us to his argument for the enrichment of the French language. So in his comparison of French to Roman models, DuBellay notes that if you look at French history at the time, it has fewer writers, and so it has less writing. Again, this is the source of Greco-Roman power in culture. There's just so much more of it. And actually, if you want to see a corollary to this that is much later, but maybe closer to what we would look at, in American history, when you look at how much we learn about New England, like Boston, Massachusetts, Salem, when we look at American history in that way, it's because that's where the universities and the libraries were. Virginia was doing quite a lot in American colonial history. New York was doing quite a lot, the Carolinas. But we talk about New England as this sort of cradle of American civilization, basically because they got to tell the story. They had the most writers. They had the most books. And so DuBellay basically makes this argument about Latin as the lingua franca of European literary culture. And in this way, he compares French to a budding plant. Okay, French literary culture is a plant that is just starting to bud, and France needs to learn to cultivate the plant. All right. What he's arguing for here is the development of craft. Okay, there is nothing coming from the muses or inspiration here. He's saying this is a craft. This is a set of skills that we as French people have not yet cultivated because we are so concerned with being good in Latin. And that's cool, but we need to cultivate our own little plant. Now, that does not mean that we discard Greek and Latin. And this is one of the things that sometimes confuses people because it seems very contradictory or paradoxical, but it's not. And here's why. While Greek and Latin is not considered to be inherently superior, the fact does remain that it has already been cultivated and highly developed over many centuries. A couple thousand years by this time, and so it provides a model for a national literature. So basically, DuBellay is saying, let's not keep writing in Latin, but let's try to develop ourselves using Latin as a model. And so it should be a model for a national literature, and it should be imitated. And in fact, he gives us this example where he says it actually has been imitated. Where has it been imitated? Well, this is what the Romans did with the Greeks. Latin was the Roman vernacular language, and it was the language in which Romans imitated Greek poetic forms. So when you go and you read Roman mythology and you go, oh, Jupiter is Zeus, right? Or you go and you read the Virgil's Aeneid and you go, this sounds like a Roman version of Homer, right? What we're saying is that, the dominance of Latin came about in the first place because Roman culture was imitating Greek culture. So DuBellay says, in order to sort of get rid of the dominance of Latin and elevate French language, French vernacular literature to something as noble and respected as Latin, we should actually imitate Latin and Greek poetry, but in French. And so the question then, of course, is how does DuBellay feel about this split between art and inspiration? And he's 100% on the side of the arts, or art as a craft, right? Poets are not born, but they're cultivated. He continues with this plant metaphor. And talent alone is never enough. Study is necessary. Furthermore, imitation is necessary, imitation of Greek and Roman forms, but that imitation should play to the poet's strengths. In other words, the way you develop a good French literary culture is not just to translate Greek and Roman art into French, but also to imitate it in such a way that is specifically French. All right. And so, what are the arts that are to be imitated? Of course, Homer, Virgil, and friends. And that's how you build a national literature, according to Joachim DuBellay. Now, each of these texts and each of these authors brings quite a lot to the table in terms of theory and criticism. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're primarily sort of thinking about their contributions to the popularization of vernacular literature, or of the vernacular as a vehicle for literary culture. And so we should remember what the stakes are for each of them. So for Dante, vernacular Italian, or specifically the Tuscan dialect, is considered to be a sacred vessel for truth, and one that is on par with Latin in terms of its ability to deliver the truth. For Boccaccio, the vernacular is a practical and noble medium of expression. Practical because more accessible, but also no less noble than Latin or Greek, and so it is worthy of respect. DuBellay basically sort of absorbs both of these observations, but builds on them and uses this argument in favor of the French vernacular as an aesthetic project with linguistic implications that have political consequences. And history has borne these all out, by the way. Chances are, for example, if you were raised in a church, you didn't read the Bible or have it preached to you in Latin. People used to do that, and it wasn't very accessible. Furthermore, look at how the arts, specifically arts that use language like songwriting, literature, proceed now. There are national literatures, and they write in their own languages. To such an extent that we have actually what is called local color, where people write in their own local accents, and it has very much enriched literature rather than impoverished it. I think an argument could be made that one of the material causes of this shift is actually that there was nothing else to do in Latin. Greek and Latin had run their course as the literary languages. Everything had been done, and so we needed something new. But whatever it is, we definitely live in a world that is culturally richer because people write in their own languages and don't worry about the respectable, literary, sacred languages. And we have these three, among others, to thank for that, as well as their reading of Aquinas and Augustine and Plato and Aristotle. And so we have here a pretty good foundation for moving into modern or early modern criticism, theory, literary scholarship.